For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Pockney, and I'm an ecologist with Biolinks Alliance. I'm presenting from Taungurung country tonight, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that to all First Nations people here with us tonight. Here at Biolinks Alliance, we rely on the generosity and support of our donors, so we'd also like to extend a sincere thank you to all of our donors. None of what we do would be possible without your support. So on to tonight's webinar, a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded, so we'll be sharing that with everyone who has registered, and it'll be available on our website as well. Please keep yourselves on mute and your videos off, other than our presenters, just being mindful of the recording and of everyone else present as well. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, so please pop any questions into the chat as they come into your head, and we'll get to them later on. And we are joined by our Senior Communications Manager, Georgia, who will be collating all those questions and firing them at Bert and I later on. And Georgia will also keep the chat ticking over with some useful links and things like that for everyone here tonight. You're going to hear a bit about the current state of Glideways collaboration in Central Victoria, where everything's at. And I'll speak briefly about a project that I've been involved in over the last year or so. And then ecologist Bertram Lobert will talk about some findings and implications of greater glider surveys in the Strathbogies. Before we get to that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sophie Bickford, Biolinks Alliance's Executive Director. Sophie's been involved with Glideways from the start, and she'll give us a bit of an introduction to Glideways in Central Victoria and some of the background behind it. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming along and joining us on this Monday night. Look, I'm not going to speak for long, but because I've been around Glideways since its inception, I put my hand up to just give a little bit of a sense of the history of the program. And look, just putting some words together on it tonight made me realise Glideways is actually having its 10th anniversary this year. It was born in 2014 in New South Wales from the Great Eastern Ranges Connectivity Conservation Collaborative, which is a partnership sort of project that extends all the way along the Great Dividing Range in Australia, so sort of Grampians up to Cape York. And we had a meeting back in 2014 and talked about what sort of projects could we collaboratively do that would restore landscapes over really large spatial scales, as sort of spatial scales that climate change is telling us that we need to work at. And the Glideways program was born then, and since then it's expanded from New South Wales to Victoria. 2 years after that, we held a symposium in Seymour, so that was 2016, and that really tested the sort of currency of the vision to restore healthy and functional and resilient landscape habitats for gliders in this part of the world. And I think that workshop or symposium really showed that there was a really great interest in gliders in Central Victoria. There were many community groups doing great work around them, monitoring for them, doing nest box habitat enhancement type work. And it showed there was about 80 people that came to the symposium. There were about 7 local groups that presented their work, but there are also some really fabulous ecologists that we brought in to talk about sort of the latest conservation science around gliders. And what that meeting showed, that there was a real appetite for more information from the community groups doing great work with them for information around their ecology and conservation. And a real appetite for sharing of practical ecological restoration knowledge. So lots of things sort of rippled out from that first symposium. The symposium spawned the development of new projects. It enhanced collaborations around projects that were already happening between scientists and some of those community groups. Look, one example was in the Bendigo region. The field gnats in Bendigo had been surveying for gliders, phascogales, in the box ironbark forest for 30 years there. And they paired up with one of the ecologists that presented at that symposium, and two really important research papers have come out since that time. So these are the sort of things that fermented from that initial meeting. And then ongoing collaborations. So one of the things that really, another message that came out of that first meeting was that the groups were doing great stuff, but they wanted support to be able to do more. The knowledge, but also support from ecologists, financial support to be able to do more than they were doing. And so over the last few years, we've been working on how we can provide that support. And we've had we held another symposium in 2020, and that was a phenomenal event that was organised with Bert from Strathbogies Rangers Conservation Management Network and Gail from Wombat Forest Care. We put together an enormous program of 2 days of talks, 31 expert speakers around squirrel gliders and greater gliders, and all those talks are now still available online for people to access on our Biolinks Alliance Knowledge Hub, and they've been viewed a lot since 2020. I think we've had over 2,500 viewings of those expert talks, which is great. And so that resource is online, and I really recommend anyone who's interested in following up from today to dip into them. So yeah, and look, another really significant thing that happened to develop the Glideways program in Central Victoria was the appointment of Chris Pockney. So Chris, who obviously introduced us tonight, has really brought his sort of great knowledge on wildlife ecology to the bear, and reconvened those original partners that have stayed strong, and actually new partnerships that have come since that initial meeting together to think about where Glideways should head in the future. And he's done work on supporting groups to develop local action plans around glider conservation, as well as develop the collaboration to where it is today. And so look, with that, the 10 years of history, of potted summary of Glideways, I hand over to Chris to talk about the interesting stuff.
Thanks, Sophie. So early last year now, we sort of brought together all of those interested groups and some sort of new players as well to a workshop, and that was really just to give Glideways in Central Victoria almost a bit of a reboot after a year or two of sort of not too much happening, and developing sort of what we want to really achieve over the next couple of years. A big part of that was actually mapping all of the work that's going on in the area, basically across Central Victoria, and this map shows sort of the various projects that are either ongoing or proposed by groups involved in the Glideways collaboration in Central Victoria. There's probably a little bit of updating to do on this map now. Some of the boundaries are a bit rough, but it gives you a really good idea of just the breadth of stuff that's happening across Central Victoria, and the reach, I guess, of these community conservation groups mainly driving a lot of this work with really limited resources. And I think it's sort of, I've discussed this with Sophie, it gives us a lot of inspiration and confidence, really, that if these groups are that are doing this sort of work are properly resourced, imagine what we can do across this whole region. A couple of, I guess, particularly interesting projects that I've been sort of privy to that have been building up over the last couple of years. There's a really ambitious community-led squirrel glider focused project that's spearheaded by Project Platypus around Dadswells Bridge out towards the Grampians out here. You might have heard about this project if you tuned into our AGM last year, but that's one that we're really excited about, and it's pretty much ready to hit the ground pending funding. So fingers crossed we see some action on that this year. Another one is a proposed biolink between the Tallarook and Mount Disappointment state forests. and that's largely off the back of some great community survey work that's been led by the Beam Mitchell Environment Group. We've been doing a mountain of work led by Paul McGregor out there, and I actually went out on one of their community surveys on Saturday night. We saw 6 greater gliders and a couple of koalas on about a 1 kilometer walk. So little plug for that group as well, Beam Mitchell Environment Group. They're running more of these surveys that are open to public, so I highly recommend keeping an eye out for those. But yeah, that's something that, again, pending some further support for that project, we'd really love to see more happening in that area. Another one is our Kangaroo Creek project, which if you've been following Biolinks Alliance for a little while, you might have heard of this. So involving sort of works on private properties bordering the Wombat Forest. About a bit over 18 months ago now, we installed nest boxes for greater gliders on one property. And over the last few months, we've put cameras up to monitor those. And we were really excited to find we had greater gliders using at least 2 of the 9 nest boxes that we monitored. So some really cool stuff coming out of a lot of this work, and it's really just driven from sort of the grassroots community level. But the whole, I guess, big output of this workshop and subsequent meetings was developing a collaborative sort of action plan for Glideways for the next couple of years, and what do we want to achieve. So we landed on 4 key priorities for Glideways in Central Victoria over sort of a 2-year period. And they came from input from 12 partner and stakeholder groups. So a really wide range of perspectives and expertise going into this. But in the next 2 years, we want to see increased capacity of community groups to actually undertake glider and phascogale conservation projects. We want, as a whole, an improved understanding of where gliders and phascogales are in the landscape and what are their threats. And we're also working on sort of a range of outputs to benefit the entire collaboration. So things like survey guides, how you might, detect certain species in your area, and even communication strategies for the whole collaboration. And we also want to be building towards, I guess, the key goal of Glideways, which is positive, measurable ecological outcomes for gliders and phascogales in Central Victoria. This is sort of something that we don't expect to necessarily see really strong progress towards in the short term. It's a real long-term goal, sort of thinking 10 years. But we want to be able to start measuring some indicators of this through, habitat quality and connectivity and things like that over the next few years. I'm going to whiz through a really quick project summary about a project that I was involved in. It was a partnership with Hughes Creek Catchment Collaborative, Beam Mitchell Environment Group, and Mitchell Shire Council, and Biolinks Alliance was brought in as a partner and focusing on the squirrel glider. That's an endangered species in Victoria, and they're threatened by habitat destruction and fragmentation because they rely on large old trees for hollows for nesting, and they need habitat to be connected to actually move around the landscape as well. So going back a bit, in late 2022, we were contacted by a local Seymour landholder through our glider record submission app, which you can find through our website. And this basically, if you've seen a glider or a phascogale on your property, it's a direct line to get in touch with us, and and we can follow up with that from there. But this landholder believes she'd seen a squirrel glider on her property, and this was sort of, there aren't many squirrel gliders records around Seymour, basically. But we went out along with Bert and had a look, and yeah, this squirrel glider photographed here was found on this property. And so the other 3 yellow dots are the extent of the locations where squirrel glider records, reliable records around Seymour since 1990. So you can see, I guess, the scarcity of knowledge around where this species is in this landscape. And before we recorded this glider, the most recent reliable record was this one in here from 2009. So there was a 13-year gap between this record and the previous one before we were lucky enough to find this one. So that was a really significant um, finding. And I guess if you know sugar gliders or Crefts gliders, as they're now known in our region, you've probably noticed that this squirrel glider looks a hell of a lot like one of them. And so kind of had a bit of a theory that squirrel gliders might not have been missing from this area per se, and that's, they're not being not detected because they're missing, but I think with a lack of awareness in a community, you get sort of misidentified individuals, and so you don't get those records. But fast forward a few months, and last year we were approached to partner on a project with sort of two key aims in the Seymour area. That was to improve the awareness and understanding of squirrel gliders around Seymour, and to engage the community, to really encourage them to act as stewards of this species and their habitat. So it was sort of multi-pronged. The first part of the project involved students from Seymour College building nest boxes and their woodworking class for squirrel gliders, and these were installed along Whiteheads Creek in Seymour to provide nesting opportunities. And there was also some revegetation in this area, so planting of both canopy and sort of mid and understory species. So you're getting a mix of habitat and food resources for squirrel gliders into the future. We ran 3 spotlighting surveys at different sites, and we recorded at least 4 squirrel gliders throughout these surveys. We also recorded a pair of barking owls, which didn't want to look at the camera, but we got some photos of them. And that was really significant as well. So they're a critically endangered species in Victoria. We recorded a koala and a whole bunch of other sort of nocturnal species right in the heart of Seymour. So that was really great to show the local community, what is persisting in that landscape. And we also surveyed some nest boxes which were installed almost a decade earlier along Lamb Gully Road between Seymour and Avenel. And we recorded at least 1 squirrel glider using one of these nest boxes, and a handful of other gliders that we couldn't confidently ID that may have been squirrel gliders as well. But potentially Crefts gliders, just with how similar they do look when they're curled up in the bottom of a box. Every box as part of this survey, and I think there were 30 odd, showed signs of occupancy. And we also got a brush-tailed phascogale nest in one of the boxes, so another threatened species, and really promising to see those species present in a landscape that is really fragmented. From an ecological perspective, this was a really successful project. We show that these threatened species are persisting around Seymour, which is quite a built-up and fragmented landscape. It looks like the Goulburn River is a really essential biolink for squirrel gliders. So most of the squirrel glider records were along the river, and that's also where a lot of the big trees are, and things like silver wattle that they'll often feed in. But we also saw squirrel gliders and phascogales are using roadside habitat, and roadside habitat is a bit of there's lots of pros and cons to it. It's obviously not ideal to have a lot of our threatened species concentrated on the roadsides, but at the same time, that's often all that's left in these fragmented landscapes. So really important to look after that habitat. And again, this is just sort of showing the value of that. And we can be really confident that protection and connectivity of the habitat that exists, and expanding that habitat, these populations will expand with it. But it also highlights, the importance of that survey and monitoring work, which often goes a little bit under the radar, and it's not as it's quite old school. It's not that exciting all the time, but before we can do anything to help these species, we really need to know where they are. I guess the other aspect of this project that was really successful was the community engagement. We've straight away raised a whole lot of awareness in the community of this cryptic threatened species that's in their area. We had over 70 people attend spotlighting surveys across 3 events, and across a couple of presentations presented to about 50 people. And I think that community stewardship of some of these species is a really, hopefully, a long-lasting impact of this project. That how excited the students were to get their nest boxes up in the trees and see that was really promising for this sort of stuff going forward. So I think it was quite a short project, a short pool of funding and things like that. But it's, I think, a really clear example of the importance of bringing the community along with you, and the importance of just understanding what factors are actually, interplaying to determine where some of these species are still hanging on in what we think are pretty poor landscapes otherwise for wildlife. So yeah, really exciting project that I loved being a part of. But that is it from me. Over to you, Bert, and the Greater Gliders.
Oh, okay. Thanks for that, Chris. And hello, everyone. So I'm going to give you a really quick helicopter overview of what's happening, what we know broadly about southern greater gliders in the Strathbogie Forest, and then compare that to some more recent work from last year, some survey work that has happened in a different part of the Strathbogie Ranges. So this project and the two groups that sort of have been doing this work, the Save Our Strathbogie Forest Group and the Strathbogie Ranges Conservation Group, a CMN that sort of covers the Strathbogie Ranges, have a part of the Glideways project, which has been great. All I did was forget to put the CMN logo on the first screen, but never mind. And all this work's done on Taungurung country. So we've managed to, really happily build some good connections with the Taungurung Land and Waters Council through this and other projects. So the southern greater glider, most people will be aware, an endangered species nationally and at state level. The Strathbogie Forest is a known stronghold, but elsewhere in the ranges, they are poorly known. There are some records, but this was an opportunity that came up last year to delve in a little bit more detail. Next slide, Chris, please, into what we know about them. So I'll just provide some really quick context in just to bring everybody onto the same page. This is southern greater glider, Pedoroides volans. This is the black and white animal. They range through to fairly grey, but highly distinctive animal, reasonably easily detectable, although not as easily detectable we know now as we once thought. That might come up later in the talk. Next slide, please. I won't go into a lot of the ecological and sort of behavioural stuff that characterises greater gliders because we just don't have time, but some of that might come out or can come out in the chat or the questions. And again, just for context, this is a view of the Strathbogie Forest from a very popular and well-known lookout called Rocky Ned, with the higher altitude ridges and peaks on the skyline. So those ridges and peaks that are about 900 to 1,000 metres. Next slide. And thankfully, even though the Strathbogie Forest has, a decent disturbance history, there are still places where big old trees with hollows are reasonably, or at least relatively common, compared with other parts of the Strathbogie, other parts of the greater gliders range in Victoria. And here's just some demonstrations. And I should just say, I'll keep going, Chris, next slide, that all of this work, just none of it would have happened without just awesome community support, both in terms of the survey work, the citizen science work, as well as the advocacy and activism that has had to go hand in hand with, making these arguments to get better management for the forest. Next slide. And just a sobering slide, just to remind us all that these ranges, certainly the high altitude, higher rainfall part of the ranges, were once completely clothed in these kind of peppermint gum forests or Herbridge foothill forest, you might call them foothill forests. This is the Strathbogie tableland. That's the sort of early Strathbogie township in the foreground, and the effect of probably a generation's worth of ringing of the manna gums and the messmates and the peppermints. So it's a stark reminder and of what we can do in a fairly quick time if we put our minds to it. Next slide, please. So this is the habitat distribution model, and not going into too much detail, but for the region around the Strathbogie Ranges. So the Strathbogie Ranges broadly is that red polygon in the centre of the screen, and the brown bits, the dark brown bits, are the modelled good habitat for southern greater gliders that is left. So this is all the remnant native forest. And you can see just at a glance that it's already in this part of its range highly fragmented. Has probably been fragmented historically anyway, pre-European times, but now is significantly fragmented. The Talarook Range down in the bottom left, which is really sort of part of the granitic landscape that the Strathbogies is part of. The Highlands Caveat District, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the Strathbogie Forest. And sort of just for reference, the Strathbogie Forest, those sort of light greenish, yellowish, browny bits within the Strathbogie Forest, they're areas that have been cleared for pine plantations. So that's contributed most of the fragmentation. Next slide, please. Same view, but now with all the dots that are the documented greater glider records from all sources. So this is from the Atlas of a Living Australia. And again, I've just sort of wrapped some polygons around the obvious island populations that currently exist. Again, the Talarooks down the bottom, the Strathbogie Forest sort of center top right, yeah. And then some smaller islands. So the one just to the left or the west of the Strathbogie Forest is the Mount Wombat Garden Range. So that's still got a seemingly healthy but small population of greater gliders, even though it's been completely isolated, effectively isolated for at least 150 years. And at the centre polygon is that Highlands Caveat District, which I'll talk more about at the end. So an overview of the Strathbogie Forest. It's not huge, 25,000 hectares. That's the green bit on the map. Just about all public land. There is some private land, native forest around the edges, particularly on the south of the Strathbogie Forest, but essentially public land. And at this point in time, state forest, although there is a recommendation to the state government that this should become a cultural reserve with some sort of management or co-management by a Taungurong Committee of Management, but hopefully also part of the National Reserve System. So the southern bits is really what we focus on for greater gliders. That's the higher altitude, higher rainfall parts of the forest. So that's the sort of 600 to 1,000 mil rainfall. It has a disturbance history, but thankfully there's been no landscape scale bushfires in recorded history. Native forest logging has finished. There is still disturbance and there are still threats, but essentially it is ready for some really good management and for some targeted evidence-based management of the forest, not just for southern greater gliders, but broadly for ecological health. So that's what we're looking towards. Next slide. And yeah, I guess just some summary findings from probably 40 plus years of both government, but also citizen science and just casual observations of greater gliders in this landscape. So the map shows the Strathbogie Forest and that small outlier, the Mount Wombat Garden Range population on the left-hand side of the map. And before I go through some of them, I won't read them all out in detail, but that red polygon is really what we now consider, or I personally consider, the sort of core population and core habitat for southern greater gliders. That, you know, that might be 15 to 20,000 hectares worth of habitat. And in 2017, government scientists from the Arthur Oler Institute for Environmental Research did some great serious research, sort of statistically valid research on greater gliders across the range. And two things really came out of that. One is to quantify the population. So there's something like 25,000 greater gliders. I mean, there are confidence intervals around that. You know, whether it's 20 or whether it's 30 isn't really known. Not that important. It's a big population in the scheme of things. But interestingly, they found using a particular survey method that gliders actually are much less detectable than we all thought they were, because they're sort of big and they don't move very fast and they've got very strong eye shine. Lots of people have thought for a long time that if you go out spotlighting and you see greater gliders, well, you're probably seeing most of them. In fact, we might only be seeing half of them. No, so that was just an interesting finding. The references are there if people want to look up those Cripps and Nelson, that literature. So in a nutshell, greater gliders in the Strathbogie Forest have not crashed. They haven't showed the population reductions that other populations in other parts of the range have. Healthy population, core habitat, which is in somewhat reasonable condition. There are several subpopulations that are stranded, and physical movement between the bigger and the smaller populations is restricted at best and possibly already non-existent at worst. And this is where the whole, the concept of glideways and connectivity, canopy connectivity, comes into play. Its part in decision-making and, a strategic approach to management. I would just point out that even though the population's healthy, we've seen local extinction of a big glider, the yellow-bellied glider in the Strathbogie Forest. Much less is known. They appear to be gone, but it's a warning sign that things can happen without you really being aware of it or knowing, unless you're keeping your eye on the ball. Next slide. So that was the Strathbogie Forest. Now I'm going to talk briefly about this Highlands Caveat district, keeping in mind that that was all once connected. Everything from the Strathbogie Forest heading in a southwest direction along the top of the Strathbogies down to Highlands Caveat and almost to Tullarook was once very similar type of forest. This is all we've got left. Next slide. So last year, through some money that a local community group had raised, we're able to do some work surveying for particularly greater gliders, but nocturnal species, I suppose. And the map on the left, that white polygon, shows roughly the study area that we looked at, and the green polygon, the sort of semi-transparent green, is all of the habitat, that is all of the forest canopy. So if you were like a ringtail or a greater glider, you could actually get, in theory, from the bottom left part of that corner up to the top right. There's enough. It's all contiguous. Some of those connections are really thin, and maybe it's only about gene flow, but nonetheless, that's the case. And all of the little yellow squills within that study area there, they're the 26 or so transects, the 14 plus kilometres that we surveyed. And in that survey, the habitat is very similar to the Strathbogie Forest, not surprisingly. And initially I thought, yeah, we're going to find greater gliders here. This looks pretty good. I feel like I could be in parts of the Strathbogie Forest. In fact, our surveys only found 3 places where we recorded southern greater gliders, and they're the blue icons with the little black dots. Some other records, and citizen science landholders did record some additional sites, which was really good. But in terms of the surveys, which we can quantify to some degrees, that's all we found. Even down towards the bottom left, which is Jacks Creek, which was the best habitat in that whole study area. And I could have, just being there, I would have thought I could be in any part of this, the better part of the Strathbogie Forest, and yet no greater gliders. Now, keeping in mind that the ARI research found that we almost miss as many gliders as we see, single observer surveys. It's hard to say that they don't occur in other parts of that range, but I think it's fair to say that if there's a core population, if I could put it that way, it's those blue dots. And throughout the rest of that area, if there are greater gliders. They're probably in really low densities, and they may not be there at all. One other thing to point out is that just about all of that green stuff is on private property. The only public land in that green area, which is that little map to the right, there are a couple of nature reserves, and they're not that big. Even the bigger ones on the very right-hand part of that map aren't very big, the Gober and the Yark Nature Conservation Reserves. So we're talking about little bits of public land, relatively large bits of private land. Next slide. So summarising what we found, we did a lot of survey work across a small area. The forest is fragmented. There are larger blocks and they're connected, but the fragmentation, as you can see from that satellite image, is significant. And we really only found greater gliders in one part of the study area. Interestingly, we found very few other hollow-dependent or hollow-utilising arboreal mammals, very few common ringtail possums, very few brushtail possums. In fact, hang on, maybe only one mountain brushtail possum and maybe only one common brushtail possum. So, something's going on, not rocket science. When you walk through those forests, they are pole forests. The number of hollow-bearing trees is noticeably low. And talking to locals about it, it's really a case of significant disturbance pre-war, but particularly post-Second World War, when mechanisation became much more available to landholders, and there was serious logging of those private forests. The public forests had less logging, but even they had some, because some of that public land wasn't reserved until the 1980s. So it's an interesting story because it's almost the inverse down here in many ways of what's happening in the Strathbogie forest. Next slide. I'm going to try and keep to time. And this is the photos along the bottom. This is what's missing. These sorts of trees occur fairly regularly, not overly abundant in the Strathbogie forest, but they're in most places. But interestingly, where they're not, you find very few greater gliders. So what are the similarities and differences between the two areas? So the similarities are kind of the physical stuff, the climate, the altitude, the veg type, right? Even human settlement time frame is similar. The differences make a difference. And I didn't practice that. Topography is really different. So the Highlands Caveat area is pretty flat. You can get everywhere in a car. In the Strathbogie forest, some areas are really deeply dissected, hard, difficult to access, steep country. Obviously, the Strathbogie forest is much larger, so probably more resilient in terms of all sorts of land use impacts. Private versus public land, I reckon, has had an influence on those things. Can't quantify it at this stage, which has impacted land use history and habitat loss, and importantly, habitat connectivity. So those green polygons, there's lots of little thin green lines that are connecting bits of habitat in the Highlands Caveat area, whereas in the Strathbogie forest, you've still got a good core area. Next slide. So I've probably mentioned all of the critical bits in those two paragraphs. Both sites, however, are still subject to threats. But there's aspects of the Strathbogie forest, because it's bigger, because there's less of an edge, the edge effect, or the ratio of the edge to the area is less for the Strathbogie forest, whereas the fragmented forest of the Highland Caveats district is much more vulnerable to whether it's catastrophic, whether it's weather events or catastrophic weather events or climate change. Too frequent fire, it has been a sleeping issue probably, but it's a massive threat to general ecosystem health. And big old trees are so vulnerable to, well, cool burns, or however we want to frame planned burning. The one in the middle there, extreme heat, has come out of recent research over the last 10 years or so. So Southern Greater gliders, we should call them Strathbogie gliders. Anyway, Southern Greater gliders are physiologically, at least in Victoria, unable to cope with, it appears, unable to cope with high overnight minimum temperatures. Now, it's not entirely certain whether that is the absolute temperature, or whether the correlation with overnight minimum temperatures is actually a correlation that's pointing to a different sort of pointy impact. Because after all, greater gliders, before we split them before they were split a few years ago, they occurred from Victorian Central Highlands up to bloody North Queensland. So at some level, physiologically, ecologically, they have been very adaptable, at least during their evolutionary history. So exactly the impact that physiologically that extreme heat has, I think, is something that will probably be teased out much more fully in time. But whether it's small fragmented sites or larger intact sites, the threats are still very real. And we know from research over the last 20 to 30 years that a common species can become rare under our noses if we're not paying attention. So one of the objects of the Strathbogie Ranges Conservation Group, and also the South Strathbogie Forest Group, is to try and keep an eye and develop some ongoing survey and sort of mental blank advocacy programs, whether it's education and spotlight walks or doing this sort of citizen science, to try and keep on top of that, and to be advocates not just for Southern Greater gliders, but the whole broader ecosystem, those patches that we have left, that even the bigger ones are fairly small. So I think that's the end of the talk. Excellent. And leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Bert. Great to get an update. I think we'll have time for a couple of quick questions, Georgia, if we've got some.
Sorry, Chris. Yeah, thanks for those great presentations, Chris and Bert. We've got one question from Chris. If the proposed FERA wind farm is approved, would that further fragment the native vegetation in the Highlands area? That's probably one for you, Bert.
Well, the easy answer is I don't know, because so much isn't known about that proposal, and being completely transparent, the survey work was done in order to collect information that would help decision making around biodiversity management in the face of not just that FERA wind farm proposal, but any sort of land use changes. So the short and the honest answer is I don't know. It depends entirely where they decide to put some of the infrastructure, but I'd certainly be an advocate for just making sure that we don't lose any biodiversity assets because there's so few left, especially in that region. Remember how fragmented that already is. And 100-meter or a 50-meter gap, extra 50-meter gaps in the canopy could have a big influence on any of those, not just Southern Greater gliders, but any of the canopy dependent or disturbance sensitive species.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for that answer, Bert. We don't seem to have any more questions tonight, but I'll put into the chat Chris's email, and feel free to email Chris after the webinar if you've got any further questions for either Bert or Chris, and they can come back to you over the course of the week. And I'll now just throw back to Chris to close the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Georgia. Thanks again for your time, Bert and Sophie, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in. Yeah, feel free to get in touch if you have any questions or want any more information about Glideways in Central Victoria. And head to our website to subscribe and keep up to date with what we're doing. Feel free to follow us across all our socials. And thanks again to all of our donors and supporters who make our work possible. So that's it for tonight. This recording is hopefully going to be in your inbox sometime tomorrow. And yeah, we hope to see you next month. Stay tuned.